So let's talk a little bit about one of my favorite subjects, which is philosophical science fiction. These are science fiction novels that I think do a great job of exploring particular philosophical themes through literature. Now, I've done a few videos about this before. I'm going to put links down to a little playlist below, so if there is some book that you think I should definitely have talked about in this video, but for some reason I don't talk about it, well, there's a good chance that I've talked about it in a previous video. But since there are so many great science fiction novels that don't just explore science, but actually explore philosophy as well, it's pretty easy to overlook some pretty big contributors, especially if I want to make this video not 3 hours long. The first book I want to talk about today is Adrian Tchaikovsky's Children of Time. Now, this is part of a series. There's also Children of Memory and Children of Ruin. I have only read Children of Time, but eventually I'm going to get to Children of Memory and Children of Ruin. I like Children of Time a good bit. Now, one of the things that's really great about this is that a lot of science fiction is always from a human perspective, and if we explore maybe an alien species, we often kind of make them humanoid. Now, sometimes this is for technical limitations, especially if you're not doing something in a book, but instead doing it, say, on a stage or on a screen. We've really been limited by the fact that we're going to have human actors who are performing. This is why early Star Trek episodes basically only have humanoids. But also, it is very hard for us to conceptualize what it would be like to be a consciousness that was not in a human body. And Adrian Tchaikovsky tries to tackle this head on in Children of Time. Children of Time is based on the idea that there was a terraforming project which was going to inject a kind of mutation into a species of apes, which were then going to evolve at a hyper-accelerated rate. Due to some catastrophes, actually what you might call a case of eco-terrorism, this does not work, but the mutation still makes it to this terraformed planet where it infects a variety of insects. And given actually Tchaikovsky's focus, one of the dominant species becomes spiders. Now, I actually have a mild case of arachnophobia, so this book did make me feel a little unsettled sometimes, but Tchaikovsky does a great job of exploring how not just a civilization would evolve if it was made up of spiders rather than humanoids, but also how consciousness would be different. This is a consciousness that often perceives the world through rhythm or vibration, thinking of things as webs, rather than primarily through sight, because human beings are primarily sight-based creatures. This when we think of perception, we think of sight. The book also dives into what it would be like to be a human consciousness that was no longer embodied. And it's a great parallel storyline that really emphasizes the embodiedness of cognition. Now, if you're interested in that in the philosophy realm, there's an essay I would recommend by the philosopher named Thomas Nagel called What Is It Like to Be a Bat?, which argues that it would be very difficult and perhaps impossible for us to fully understand what it would be like to be a consciousness or to perceive in a way that was radically different than our own. And that's because we tend to believe that this kind of experience can only be felt from a first-person perspective. So while it might be a philosophical impossibility for us to fully understand the consciousness of another kind of creature, Tchaikovsky's book is an exploration of empathy across species lines, actually, in a way that you really don't expect, and also the centrality of the body to perception, and in a way that really challenges a hard distinction between the mind and the body. Even if they are different substances or different entities, they are going to be so thoroughly enmeshed, and they are going to interact, and they are going to affect each other in really important ways. And that's one of the reasons that I think if you like philosophical science fiction, you really should be reading Adrian Tchaikovsky. The second book on our list today is Neal Stephenson's Snow Crash. Snow Crash, I think, has two main philosophical themes in it. One of them is the relationship between reality and virtual reality. How real is something like a metaverse? And we'll talk about that in just a second. But another one is a kind of exploration that you see in a lot of cyberpunk and a lot of sort of dystopian-ish science fiction. Some of the stuff that you see in Philip K. Dick, you also see it in Octavia Butler, is what is the future going to be like as corporate power increases? Now, I think that the diagnosis for how certain corporations are going to be able to increase their power and domination over us, essentially, is going to be very different when you talk to different authors. Stevenson himself has like a lot of libertarian sympathies, so his explanation for it's going to be a bit different than others. But all of these writers share this concern with human freedom and whether or not human freedom is consistent with this like large amount of corporate power. And this is a great theme in political philosophy. And so because of those themes, it very neatly dovetails with a lot of books that I would typically recommend. In fact, a book that I recommended in an earlier list of philosophical books for beginners was called Private Government by Elizabeth Anderson. And it's about how corporations and how employers can actually exercise a kind of coercive control over us that we typically would object to if anyone else did it. And thinking critically about corporate power is pretty essential, I think. So I would recommend Private Government by Elizabeth Anderson if you are looking for pairings to go along with Neal Stephenson on the social elements, on the stuff in political philosophy. But the other theme really is the metaverse and reality, or something like this. This is an area that I think has been really under-theorized by philosophers. There aren't a lot of philosophers thinking in a lot of detail about virtual reality, augmented reality, the metaverse, or anything like this. The only book that I know of, and I haven't read it, is David Chalmers' book, Reality Plus. That is going to be an essential topic of philosophical and social thinking coming forward, because even if I am very much opposed to something like a metaverse, I have no real interest in it. The truth is, it is where I think we're heading. I think increasingly we are going to live our lives in something like a metaverse, and so we need to think critically about it now before we make those choices, before we leap in. And one of the ways we can think critically is by doing philosophy, but another way is by reading the fiction that has been thinking about these issues for a very, very long time. The next book that I want to recommend is Hyperion and the Fall of Hyperion by Dan Simmons. I know there are other Hyperion novels. I've read the first two, and I didn't feel the need to continue because I felt by the end of that second book, the story was really kind of neatly wrapped up for me. If I should read it, let me know down below. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Now, there is so much going on in Hyperion. Hyperion is a beautiful case of science fiction, just great writing from a science fiction writer, great horror elements. I don't even really love horror books, but I really liked Hyperion. But what's really interesting, I think, is that in that second book, there is a massive subplot that becomes really relevant to a lot of the concerns or discussions that we're going to be having more and more. From the very first book, we know that there are large-scale sentient AI that somehow kind of govern the world. They are ineffable to us. It's very hard for us to understand them. And because it's very hard for us to understand them, they've actually kind of separated themselves from us. They get to control infrastructure and all of these other things, but we've entered into kind of a steady truce. But we see in the second book that at least some of those artificial intelligences are going to turn against us and actually start viewing humanity as part of the problem. Now, these themes have been explored in other books as well. 2001: A Space Odyssey is a great example of this, both as a movie and as a book. I think if you're interested in the fact that we would have these super intelligences that could be so much more powerful than us and could be quite dangerous, you should also read Ian Banks's culture novels. And if you're looking for a philosopher who's talked about this a little bit, I would talk about Nick Bostrom, and I would especially recommend his book, Superintelligence, which is all about this problem of AI alignment and AI safety. As we are seeing AI, or at least large language models, explode in power and in popularity, there is a worry about how they are going to be properly aligned with human interest. And we need to solve that problem. AI is, again, it's one of these things that is going to happen, and we need to make good use of it. We can't just so we need to be very careful about how we design it, and we need to carefully assess the risk and the potential rewards that come from using these large language models, or these AI, or even these human-like intelligences. And if we're going to talk about AI, well, that brings me really quickly to today's sponsor, which is Motion. Motion is an AI-powered task and calendar system. So when you start up Motion, you can integrate some calendars, you can start projects, and you can start adding tasks. And that's basically it. You can mess around with settings where you talk about the priority of a task, which ones are more important, do any of them have deadlines? All of that's great. But after that, you don't really have to do a lot of thinking, because Motion's AI will start finding time in your calendar for you to complete those tasks. One of the things I think is really important if you are someone juggling a busy schedule with work and with other projects and with family is finding the time to actually do the work or do the things that you think are important. And the thing that isn't important, the thing that we have to take care of, but we wish we didn't have to, is scheduling or figuring out when we're going to do any of that. Well, Motion is basically taking all of that work out of your hands. So if you're interested in using Motion and you want to save some time and save a bit of money, you can use my link down below, get a nice discount, and see how Motion can work for you. All right, the last book on our list is a duology by Arkady Martin, and that is A Memory Called Empire and A Desolation Called Peace. A Memory Called Empire is really interesting as kind of an interstellar political drama, so I do like it for those reasons. I also like the kind of influence of the Byzantine Empire in this book, which I think is a great resource for inspiration that a lot of people are simply overlooking. It's not our go-to standard cultural reference for either science fiction or fantasy. We tend to actually think about the Roman Empire, and even though the Byzantine Empire considered themselves the Roman Empire because they were the eastern half of the Roman Empire, we tend to really privilege the western half for our cultural references. Martine doesn't fall in that. I like her use of that Byzantine imagery. But the stuff that's philosophically the most interesting is the role of memory in personal identity. The main character in A Memory Called Empire has a kind of implant in her, which has all of the memories and experiences of a former ambassador. So as she becomes the new ambassador, she gets to take on this implant and kind of continue this lineage. And one of the themes that comes up again and again in this book is how distinct are you if you can somehow amass a person's entire memories, like all of their memories? Do you sort of become one person? How do you maintain individuality? How could we say that one person has survived while another person has not? And in fact, a plot point that's going to come up later is another character who thinks he can live forever by passing down his memories into new bodies over and over. And that becomes an important point in the story. Philosophers have worried about personal identity for hundreds and thousands of years. John Locke was a modern philosopher to write about personal identity and kind of set the terms of the debate for a lot of us. But if you're interested in this question about personal identity, the persistence of persons over time, how do I know that I'm the same person over time, or anything like that, a great little book is Maria Sheckman's The Constitution of Selves, which I will link down below along with all of these other books. That's a book that I've drawn on a little heavily in some work to talk about the role of narrative there. But narrative really is going to build on top of memory. So if you're interested in the connection between memory and personal identity, well, maybe you will also be interested in the topic of narrative and personal identity. Another science fiction book I wanted to mention, along with A Memory Called Empire, is Ancillary Justice by Anne Leckie, which again was the first of a trilogy. But I think that could have also gone with Children of Time, because in Ancillary Justice, there's this question about, there is a question about identity, and there's a question about artificial intelligence, and there's a question about non-embodied or non-human embodied cognition, because there are ship intelligences who have many different human hosts for their consciousness, so they can see from multiple different perspectives, but ultimately they think in very different terms than us, because they never had kind of a human body or a kind of humanoid body in the case of Ancillary Justice. Because of that, we see them think in very different terms. Distinctively, Anne Leckie chooses to write all of that book only using the feminine pronoun, because the ship intelligence makes no distinction between the sexes. And so the ship just defaults to using she for everything. It's a little disorienting. It's a disorienting read, and it's a great use of a single literary device, a single choice by an author to show us how different these creatures, these non-human persons or these non-human intelligences would think, and even that makes it hard to communicate in interesting, exciting, slightly scary ways. All right, I hope you've enjoyed this list. I'd love to hear more about philosophical science fiction, though I think this is going to be the last one on this topic that I do for quite a while, because I think we've hit a lot of the ones that I really wanted to talk about.